it's the mid-1970s. One of the assignments that every art student gets is to do a self-portrait because it's a cheap model. And you can sit for as long as you like and paint. And my first one that I'd ever done, it never even occurred to me to do a self-portrait. Of course, I was very interested as a young artist in doing portraits of others, but it never occurred to me to do one of myself. At the time, as you can see, I had pretty long hair and was a bit of a hippie. So you can see a little progression there, though, from the mid-70s to the late 70s, when there's a major change that starts to happen from a much more tightly rendered realism to a looser kind of, painterly realism to this expressive and rather dark and strange kind of painting method, which led me into a whole series of things that I was doing in graduate school in an ancient medium called encaustic, which is hot wax with pure pigments that are mixed together. And it actually is one of the most ancient painting methods, other than staining cave walls with berries. The ancient Egyptians would melt wax and mix it in with these pure colors, and they would paint their portraits on their sarcophagi. The famous Fayum sarcophagi are beautiful portraits that look as fresh today as they were when they were painted over 2,000 years ago. And that's the virtue of the encaustic medium. It gives you this absolutely pure color that doesn't age. It doesn't yellow, it doesn't turn brown. Of course, it's in wax, so if you subject it to extreme cold, it will crack. And if you if you expose it to extreme heat, it will melt. So, but those paintings that I did early in graduate school they inspired me. They were tiny little paintings you just saw there on the screen. They were about 14 inches square. They led me to doing some very large oil paintings with a similar kind of bright color and this black line kind of rhythmical compositional strategy, so different than the early work that I was doing, all the while still, in my own understanding, seeking beauty, but also allowing myself to dip into some darker emotional chords, if you will. I'm not going to spend the time today unpacking these. I'm just going to breeze right through them. So now I'm out of grad school when I'm doing this painting of a painter friend of mine named Bill Harsh, who always had a cigarette in his hand, by the way. He was a chain smoker, and sadly, Bill died of lung cancer just a few years ago. So those cigarettes caught up with him. In my portrait of him, though, I'm more interested in a kind of internal landscape, or emotional landscape that gets expressed in these imaginary plants and even this kind of snake-like form in the lower right-hand corner. Again, I won't go into interpretation. I'm just describing what I was doing. This gives you a sense of scale. This is my studio in Dorchester in the early 80s. I was pretty fresh out of grad school. I got married very young, though. I already had 2 kids at that point. We'd been married at that point for about 9 years. And I had a big studio in an old factory building in Dorchester. I did a series of paintings, speaking of marriage, about marriage problems, because after about 9 years, we were really struggling. And the male figure that was in this painting got painted out. He was on the right-hand side. He got completely painted out, which I guess is one solution to marriage problems: just abdicate, take off, leave the marriage, which looked like it might happen. But there's also hanging in there and battling it out. And as you can see, these are pretty dark, emotional dark. Even though they're brightly colored, they're emotionally dark paintings. Kind of Adam and Eve figure in this primordial garden, but it's not a happy painting, even though the colors are bright. So I was exploring these internal, like I said, this internal landscape. Still looking for beauty, still looking for hope and truth, but also being willing to look at the darker side of life, which a lot of poets and painters are willing to do. So there is this kind of simultaneous search for meaning, for beauty, for the pleasure of beauty, but also at the same time, a commitment to truth, even if that truth leads you into things you don't want to look at. And actually, one of the things I didn't want to look at was the Bible, which you see in this blue figure with a blindfold. This figure started showing up on a lot of my paintings. It's kind of a self-portrait, I guess. um, holding a black book in his right hand. Well, that book was the Bible. I started reading the Bible at that point. I was not a committed Christian at all. Um, but these themes, the world, the flesh, and the devil, sort of found their way into my work. Originally, this painting had the devil figure right up close, like the rest of these figures, like this worldly professorial figure behind me with his little glasses, this jazz player with a cat mask on, blowing a saxophone, and this nude female figure off to the left. But eventually that painting changed, and the figure of the devil is off in the background there, heading out into the desert. One of the things I got early on reading the Bible was that we don't have to be afraid of the devil. All we have to do is say, "Begone," in the name of Jesus. And I started really beginning to think about Jesus a lot at that point in the early 80s. In fact, in the winter of 1982, the day after Christmas, I committed my life to Christ. I was 30 years old. So I had my art career was well underway at that point. And my marriage was at that point, 9 years in. And so becoming a Christian when you're an adult with a lot of responsibilities, with children, with an art career, it has its complications. And I made this painting, The Gift, with the idea that there was some unseen presence always in the studio with me. And there I am behind the easel, kind of a confused looking face, reaching out to receive something. There's a theatrical mask in the foreground upside down, and a ram's skull. Often the ram is the symbol of magic or necromancy, or whatever you want to call it, occultism. There was this dark feeling there that the studio was a place of magic, not magic tricks, but magic in the sense of something reaching for power. And I was reaching out, but I was also diffident about that. But I decided to change the title, and I changed the painting. I called it The Bribe. And as you can see, I changed myself in the painting more than anything else. I got rid of the ram's skull in the lower right-hand corner. The drama is still there, and the drama mask. But in my left hand now is the Bible again. It's something that I'm trying to wrestle through. Committed to Christ, but not sure where that was going to take me as an artist. And I did this painting, Lazarus, which is, again, a kind of self-portrait. So a lot of these early paintings, right out of grad school, were kind of an autobiographical, like I said, not literal history of my life as a painter, but more the internal struggles, the landscape of the heart and the imagination. And one of the paintings I did soon after my conversion was this colossal painting, The Triumph of Suffering. And what you see in this, if it's hard to make out a bit, is on the left-hand side, there's this figure in a devil mask who's surrounded by this giant boa constrictor, this snake-like form. There's a cross in the upper left, this strange Garden of Eden, like you saw in the earlier paintings, a kind of foreboding Garden of Eden. But the snake makes its way all the way over to the right-hand panel, where there's a man praying who's kind of being choked in half by this boa constrictor, which then comes back over the shoulder of the Christ figure in the central panel and biting the hand. The snake in the lower part of the painting is biting the hand of Christ, who is completely unmoved. So I was contemplating the cross. I was trying to find a contemporary way of approaching this issue of the suffering of Jesus and why that's important, and how appearing to fail, which is, in many ways, the cross is a symbol of failure, right? He didn't dethrone the Roman government. He didn't overturn the corrupt religious leaders. He got slammed. So it's this interpretation of his suffering as a triumph, as something positive, which I'd like to talk more about in a little bit. Here's an image from my first solo show in Boston at a gallery that, get this, had been a church. Which it really seemed somehow fitting for my recent conversion. I started making these kind of quasi-Christian images. There's the world, the flesh, and the devil over on the left. There's me to show you the sense of scale. And then the triumph of suffering there in the middle in this gallery, which had been a church. And I got a write-up in the Boston Globe. It was not a completely flattering write-up, but it had some good positive things to say and some really interesting criticism that sort of helped me come to grips with what was I actually saying, or what were people seeing in my work, including well-informed critics. Around that same time, in order to try to work on our marriage and heal some of the hard things that had begun to happen, which I now believe were part of my self-centeredness as an artist. You know, starting your art career, sometimes you can be incredibly selfish. And that was hard on Meg, my wife, really hard on her. My conversion to Christianity was a surprise and a shock to her. And she actually was contemplating divorce at that point because she thought, oh no, I'm married to a self-centered, self-important artist who wants to project all that into some religious thing where he can oppress me with this patriarchal religion. So we moved to Gloucester. We moved back to Gloucester from Dorchester, and trying to sort of heal. Later on, the story ends well. You know, I'm married to Meg still after 47 years, and we did get healing for our marriage. And right around that same time is when I got hired at Gordon. So I was a fresh, minted, committed newbie Christian, and the administration at Gordon, you know, looking back on it now, I think, wow, what were they thinking hiring this guy? But anyway, there was no art department at the time. And they just said, do what you can and see if we can put together an art program, which is essentially what I did. But of course, my art search continued. And so right around that same time, having left the city and moved to this kind of rural, well, it wasn't really rural, but the West Gloucester where I live does feel rural. If you drive down our street, you'd think you were in Maine. Because of all the granite around here, there aren't a lot of houses. And so it feels relatively rural. But ironically, moving into this semi-rural North Shore area, way away from Dorchester and Boston, I started to think about the city. So for some reason, this isn't letting me advance, Ryan. Oh, maybe I just have to use a different method. Here's one of those first paintings from that period. It's called Steam and Light. It's my first image of a factory building, but this factory doesn't produce anything. It just lets off steam. And in some ways, that was my critique of the city and my own thinking. In this one, Factory 2 as well, smoke and steam and mist and, you know, toxic chemicals spewing into the air. And in the upper left-hand corner of this painting, there are these two discs that seem to be spinning, or maybe they're Klieg lights or something. They keep showing up, these two lights. Keep showing up in a bunch of my paintings, you'll see later on. I also did a series of paintings around the same time called Man and Machine. Clearly a rather tumultuous relationship of the man and the machine. This one's called Crucifixion. This one's called The Spirit of the City, Ir Re'em in Hebrew, because I was starting, again, to try to integrate my art and my faith, trying to integrate my search for beauty and meaning with my search for Christ, for obedience to him, to his spirit, and trying to understand, what does it mean? Why do people make cities? I also discovered something really interesting at the time, that the ancient Hebrews believed that cities were overseen by a particular spirit, like the spirit of Babylon, or the spirit of Sumeria, or the spirit of Jordan, or whatever. You know, they believed in these spirits. You know, there's a residue of that in our culture with this so-called spirit of St. Louis, if you ever heard that phrase. But I was interested in trying to get at this idea that the city had a spiritual dimension to it. And around the same time, I was reading the novels of Charles Williams, who was a good friend of C.S. Lewis and J.R. Tolkien. I don't know if you've read any of his work. It's rather strange stuff. It's not nearly as easy to read as C.S. Lewis or Tolkien, but it's really interesting. And in one of Charles Williams's stories, All Hallows Eve, he does what he calls a spiritual portrait of London, which was exceedingly strange and was very compelling to me. And I did a whole series of paintings called A Dream of Wet Pavements. There are those Klieg-like discs up in the upper right-hand corner this time, but they're actually figures now. They're the two witnesses that are mentioned in the book of Revelation. But in this cityscape, there's a waterfall coming down over top of a building. There's something different happening in these cityscapes. There's that waterfall again and those spinning discs. These are large paintings. This one here is about 6 feet square. Dystopian, I guess, is one way of describing them. around this same time, 1986, or just before that, the film Blade Runner came out. I don't know if you've seen the film, but it's always wet in that film, and the city is full of steam, and it's a dark place, a place of wrestling, and it's an interesting story. I highly recommend it. This was called Moonrise Over Wet Pavements. It's not clear whether the waters are rising or receding. The moon is coming out there in the clouds above. One of my students who saw this, because I was at Gordon at that point, I'd been at Gordon a couple of years, and I showed I did this very same thing then. I was trying to show my work to try to help my students understand how an artist thinks and what an artistic journey is like. And the student said, "Oh, dueling bridges." So it looked like these two bridges were having a fight. But in any case, one of the things I was trying to get at with these cityscapes, these imaginary cities, was the beauty and intrigue and also simultaneous darkness. So the paradox of the collision of those two things, light and darkness. Also trying to understand social justice in the city, which is a fraught place. It's not a place where it's easy to live, ironically. When you think of why people build cities, they build them so they can be closer together and they can share things, but actually it ends up becoming a place where murder and theft and corruption break in. And so this prophet figure you see there in the center blowing on a shofar, the Hebrew horn to call to worship, but also to battle. These two women on a conveyor belt or some kind of contrivance are like objectified, sex trafficked women. This is not a place of justice. It's a place of injustice. But I turned that painting upside down and repainted it and retitled it, The Man and the Machine. So you can still see the machine upside down, but Christ is over here on the right. And he is, to my way of thinking, again, in weakness and in apparent failure, disabling the machine. He's jamming the machine, as it were, raging against the machine. Mid-'80s, still at Gordon, starting to lose heart about those darker paintings and wanting to sort of reconnect with something positive. So I started just going outdoors and painting. Here's Sam's Barber Shop, which used to be in this cool old building in downtown Gloucester. There's the City Hall in the morning mist. These are large paintings too. That's what I could see off my back porch when we were living in downtown Gloucester before we moved here to West Gloucester. There's City Hall in the upper right, and this is the back alley behind our house. Very large painting, probably 6 feet. The large scale, this is also about that big, this our back porch itself. I was just painting whatever I happened to be looking at, in a way, and trying to reconnect with something more positive. But again, like I said, we moved out of downtown Gloucester to West Gloucester to this place called Walker Street, which is right on a tidal estuary, a salt marsh, which is really incredibly beautiful place. And I built the house myself with a bunch of my friends in the winter of 1992. I hired a bunch of people from our church. That was a great thing. It was a challenge to be teaching at Gordon and coming home every afternoon or on my off days and swinging the hammer in midwinter. But we managed it. Strangely enough, about 5 years later, the house was struck by lightning and burned. And the fire marshal said to me afterwards, he said, I've never, in the 35 years I've been in the fire department, I've never seen a house that was so badly burned just from lightning. This was a decisive strike. And a secular Jewish friend of mine asked me, Bruce, you believe in God? Was God punishing you? This just seems like, the strangest thing. And it was literally a bolt out of the blue. There was a blue sky overhead, 3 bolts of lightning connected with our house and burned it. Lost all of my artwork, with the exception of a handful of paintings about Good Friday, which made me start thinking, maybe it was an act of God. I mean, that's what insurance companies call it, but I didn't take it as punishment. This was my library. Before we had to tear down the house from the fire damage, I went upstairs with a light and a camera and photographed my library, which had been completely charred beyond recognition. And you couldn't read any of even the spines of the books except for one. Right there in the middle of the photograph, I found one title, A Severe Mercy, which is what this really, how I took this whole thing. Rather than feeling like I was being punished, I felt like this was a gift from the Lord. It was a hard gift. This is something I found on the wall behind a picture that had fallen off. The smoke and the wind that's created by the rush of that smoke and that fire pushed the painting off the wall, and it created this image on the wall, which if I didn't tell you what it was, you might think it was a hand coming up out of the horizon in flames. And it's really, I sort of took it as a gift from the Lord, is the hand of God, blessing, not cursing. And so we rebuilt on the very same foundation. The only thing that was left, as you can see in that previous photograph, was our fireplace, which we power washed, and so it's not blackened like it was in that previous photograph. And we just built a house around it. And this is what the house looks like today. So all is well that ends well, as they say. But I learned a great deal, and I began a whole new series of paintings after that. This is the first one I did, called Our Work is Tested by Fire. And I began using this image of, ruins and scaffolding, this sort of blood red scaffolding in the background. But there's this dancing figure up in the upper left, who's the same figure that was in the Man in the Machine painting. It's Christ himself. In the foreground is this contemplative guy. Who knows, maybe he is kind of a self-portrait, but he's anybody. And the title of that series of paintings is Building in Ruins, which can be taken as a verb and a noun, a building which is in ruins, or literally the act of building in the midst of the ruins, which of course relates back to the Isaiah quote, they shall rebuild in the ruins, they shall restore the ruined cities, the desolations of many generations. So in the act of rebuilding our house, I felt like physically I was enacting something that I think all of us are called to do as Christians. I'll just quickly breeze through these. This was called Setting the Bounds. There's that scaffolding in the background. This was called Meditation, which is more of an internal sense of the rebuilding. This was called Passion, where the frescoes on the wall almost seem to be alive, and yet they're shattered and broken. And in the background, you see this. If you've been to Italy, or if you know the work of Fra Angelico, you can see his Passion painting, which was a fresco he painted in the mid 1400s in Florence, Italy. He was a monk who, all the monks had jobs, like there were cooks and there were gardeners, and his job was to paint, which is, to me, a beautiful idea that there should be a job for artists. In the early 2000s, also, I did another series of paintings called The Body Broken, Elegy for St. Catherine. I did a whole series of elegies for great saints. And this one in particular is one that I feel particularly good about. Elegy for St. Bonhoeffer, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Maybe you know about him. He resisted the Nazis. He was a 20th century saint, a man of great faith. The poet Geoffrey Hill says this: Bonhoeffer in his skylit cell, bleached by the flare's candescent fall, pacing out his own citadel, restores the broken themes of praise, encourages our borrowed days by logic of his sacrifice. Against wild reasons of the state, his words are quiet, but not too quiet. We hear too late or not too late. Bonhoeffer was under house arrest for a great deal of World War II because he refused to go along with the Nazis, like a lot of pastors were doing. You can see the swastika in the background sort of dissolving. The ruins, in this case, are the ruins of the Nazi attempted empire, the Reich, that was supposed to last 1,000 years. And the sacrifice of one honest man can undo all that madness, all those lies. There's beauty in the ruins. There's beauty in times of trial. Another series from that period, which is what I'll pretty much getting close to the end here. Woman, this is my daughter the day before she was married. And you might say this is a pre-ruined image. The painting has been scoured and scraped and sanded, and yet, there's beauty here. There's beauty where there's loss. So what is the relevance of the beautiful? This is what I'm coming to the close of my talk here, but I want to ask a few questions. Now, Theodor Adorno, a critic, said in his famous essay, Cultural Criticism in Society, after World War II, to write poetry after the death camps, after Auschwitz and Buchenwald, to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric. C.S. Lewis had a slightly different take. In his famous sermon, The Weight of Glory, which he delivered in June of 1941, this was 8 years earlier than when Adorno said what he said. He says, but we want so much more, something the books on aesthetics take little notice of, but the poets and the mythologies know all about it. We do not want merely to see beauty, though God knows that is even bounty enough. We want something else, something which can hardly be put into words, to be united with the beauty we see, to pass into it, to receive it into ourselves, to bathe in it, to become part of it. This sermon was delivered literally 1 month after the year-long bombing campaign by the Nazis of London, the Blitz, in which 40,000 people lost their lives, 150,000 were maimed and seriously injured, and 60% of all the homes in London had been destroyed. The city was almost completely destroyed. And 1 month later, Lewis is saying, beauty. We want to pass into it, receive it into ourselves, bathe in it, become part of it. There's a different perspective here. Is beauty relevant? One last quote. This is from the German philosopher in his essay, The Relevance of the Beautiful, talking about the role of tradition in our concept of beauty and art. He says, as finite beings, we already find ourselves within certain traditions, irrespective of whether we are aware of them or not, or whether we deceive ourselves into believing that we can start anew, that is, without tradition. For our attitude does nothing to change the power that tradition exercises over us. But it makes a difference whether we face up to the traditions in which we live, along with the possibilities they offer for the future, or whether we manage to convince ourselves that we can turn away from the future into which we are already moving and program ourselves afresh. For of course, tradition means transmission rather than conservation. This transmission does not imply that we simply leave things unchanged and merely conserve them. It means learning how to grasp and express the past anew. It is in this sense that we can say that transmission is equivalent to translation. So what he's saying is that every act that an artist or a poet or a composer makes stands in a tradition. You can't separate yourself from the tradition. The tradition has a hold of you, and it has to be transmitted to the next generation, but that every act of transmission is also an act of translation. It has to be reframed. It has to be translated. So what I've done since then is I've mostly engaged in collaborations, which I'm happy to share with you about. But I think I've done enough talking here, and maybe what I'll do now is stop sharing the screen and go back to maybe we can have a little conversation. I just shared a lot, obviously, but maybe you have some thoughts, maybe you have some questions. Would love to hear from you.
Bruce, thank you for that. For those of you who are joining, if you feel free to do that, go ahead and start your video. I know it's kind of hard to feel community when we're virtual like this, but we can see each other. And I don't know, I think maybe we're a small enough group if you want to just unmute yourself and ask a question. If it gets complicated, I guess we can try raising hands or something. Bruce, would that work? You could just kind of field
Oh yeah, I would
questions
love
as we
for
go.
people just to interject.
Yeah.
I had a question. So I live in Gloucester too. When you learned about how the ancient Hebrews had like certain saints over their cities and everything, did you think about how Gloucester's kind of patron saint is St. Peter? They have the St. Peter's Day festival every year and all that. And did that inspire you to do any art at all?
Well, thanks, Nolan. That's a great question. I wasn't thinking about saints in particular. What I was thinking about were spirits, principalities. In fact, there's in the Old Testament, you'll notice the Prince of Persia or the Prince of Babylon. They're not talking about actual humans. They're talking about spiritual beings, spirits who oversee a city, and they're often evil spirits. I mean, principalities and powers. That was what I was grappling with the idea that cities can be ruled by spiritual forces that are wicked. Of course, there are also good forces which are always at play. Yeah, but that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about that yet. Peter is the patron saint of Gloucester, the fisherman, of course, right?
Mm-hmm. Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Your work seemed to go from initially very dark in its content to, at least from what I could tell, considerably more hopeful. Do you think there's a specific turning point for you that you can pinpoint, since that the theme of wrestling and this kind of darkness seemed to continue past your conversion to Christianity?
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, I think all of us, when we profess Christ, have to go through a process, right? You're not suddenly all better. It's like getting over an illness. Sanctification is a process. Now, I'm actually of the opinion that sanctification continues throughout our lives, and then even after death. Roman Catholics believe that sanctification literally continues after death. In other words, we are continually growing in what they call a school of Christ, which was what purgatory is meant to be. But yeah, I think, Sophia, that if there was a turning point, it was the house fire. It's interesting that house fire sort of cleared away the debris in my mind and my heart, my imagination. It freed me in a way. It sort of erased my tracks in the sand and allowed me to try something different. And you saw a major shift in color, right? I mean, a lot of oranges and reds. One of my students pointed out to me, boy, that's the color of fire, Professor Herman. I said, I had never thought of that. Yeah, you're right. I learn about my work from other people, actually. I mean, I don't think I'm the expert on my own work. And I don't think any artist is the expert on their own work. What do you see? Is something jumped out at you?
I think for me, looking at your work, it was the house fire, but also specifically when you started doing the paintings for the saints,
Mm-hmm.
that this hope started to really push itself forward, that I think was more unadulterated than before.
Thank you. That's actually very helpful. Really, honestly, I think you're right. Yeah. Other thoughts or questions?
I was wondering, have you ever been in a place in your career where you felt like you had nothing to offer or nothing to say? And if so, like, how did you deal with that? What did you combat that with?
Thanks, Nick. Well, I'm going to be very transparent. I'm in that place right now, that place of emptiness. But I've been painting long enough that I've been here before. So I figured it out fairly recently. I've been painting in a disciplined, serious way for 50 years. I'm 68, and I started when I was about your age, 18, 19 years old. I started really getting serious about art then. And then, of course, went to art college and all that when I was in my 20s, early 20s. But so I've been to this place of emptiness and not having anything to say, and uncertainty and weakness, frankly, before. I've been here before. I think the COVID crisis and my suddenly retiring from teaching, combined with other things that I'm really not sure I even know how to name, have brought me to this place of emptiness. But what I have discovered over and over and over again in my life as a painter, and also as a husband and father and friend, is that Christ is here. He's in this place of weakness. He's in this place of loss. He's right here. It's not like he suddenly is gone, or somehow he only is there when things are going well. In fact, I think it's actually probably the reverse. That's what my paintings were trying to tell me. Yeah, I think we have to be willing to go through these times of emptiness and not quit. I mean, that's the key, is not quitting.
Mm.
If you're a filmmaker, a poet, a fiction writer, nonfiction writer, if you're whatever you like to make, don't quit when you're feeling weak. Don't quit when you feel empty. Um, Move through that darkness. And as Sophia was saying, I'm so grateful, Sophia, that you noticed this. You know, sometimes you can just paint your way out of that darkness by God's grace. You know, yeah,
Thanks, Bruce.
yeah. Thank you for the question. Anyone else?
I actually had a question related to that, I guess. Maybe the role of a Christian artist, because I'm wondering, just related to some of your comments you were just making, do you ever sense that there's a pressure maybe to move quickly through the lament or the suffering and somehow to display in your art the hope? I don't know if you particularly have felt that pressure, or would you say in general, have you seen that in other what we'd call Christian art, like that that sense that to be I don't know what, to be a good witness, that we have to quickly proclaim the hope, and move beyond the suffering or the lament? I don't know. How have you
Yeah,
balanced that, I
no,
guess, in
boy,
your work?
that is really important, Christy. Thank you for raising that question and that whole realm of conversation. It's a big one. I think there is pressure on us from, I don't know what else to call it, Christian culture, which is more just about, it's like we all are born into families, right? And we love our families, but we also find patterns of behavior in our families that are not healthy and not good. And that's true for almost everybody I know. Certainly was true for me growing up. But that's true in the church as well. The church is just a big family, and it's a messed up family. Uh, it's a wonderful family. But one of the messed up things about the church is this pressure that we put on each other to be rosy and cheerful all the time, as though we don't have to lament. But look at the Psalms. I mean, one of the reasons we ought to read the Psalms is because King David was completely transparent. I think, you know, when it says that David was a man after God's own heart, I think that's why. I think because he was completely transparent. He didn't hide anything. And some of those Psalms are just absolutely horrific. I mean, he's expressing the most egregious forms of anger and violent hatred in some of the Psalms, but also praise for God and childlike trust and, you know, healing and hope and redemption and reconciliation. But he lets it all out. And I think that would be a great thing for Christians to start doing, is being more honest with themselves and with each other. But thank you, Christy. Yeah. I don't think it's possible to be honest as an artist and play the game of being, you know, of painting rosy pictures all the time. One of the problems I had with the work of a very popular artist, Thomas Kincaid, was that he said, I want to paint a world in which the fall of man never occurred. And what the result was, with these kind of paper thin, emotionally thin paintings that were kind of cute and nice and then empty. And I think he knew it. I mean, I don't know if you know the story of Thomas Kincaid, but he had a very unhappy marriage, which ended in divorce. And then he drank himself to the point where he actually died. Um, and it's sad. I feel sad for that brother in Christ, because I believe he was a believer. But his desire to paint a world in which the fall of man never occurred is as much as saying that he has a better imagination than God. Because obviously, God has made a world in which the fall of man did occur. And there is suffering, and there is difficulty, but there's redemption. Right from the very beginning of the Garden of Eden, God had a plan B, admittedly, to redeem us. And he did, and he has, and he will. But we can't escape. We can't just nice ourselves to death. It's very dangerous to think that being Christian is to be nice. Jesus was not a nice man. He was a good man. But thanks, Christy. Boy, you see, you got me going there.
This is great. No, thank you for that.
Well, I think yeah, go ahead.
Going off
Could you
of
say that again?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Going off of what Dr. Gardner said, do you ever find yourself like halfway through a painting, kind of like your paintings of your daughter and your grandson? Those are so lively and the colors are so like kind of peaceful and hopeful. Do you ever find yourself like halfway through one of those and then like what you're feeling doesn't really match up with what the painting is kind of expressing? And like, does that lead you to being stuck or something like that?
That's an excellent question to raise. The process of making a painting, Ashley, can I ask you a question first? I will respond. What is it? What's your medium? Are you a writer? How do you express yourself?
Through graphic design and like watercolor and stuff.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I'm sure you know what I'm about to say is true, which is that to make something, anything, even a loaf of bread, to make anything requires you go through a process sometimes of loss and challenge and difficulty. Sometimes the recipe doesn't work and the bread doesn't rise. In fact, my daughter just made a loaf of bread last week that didn't rise. And I think every artist goes through this. In the process, sometimes you feel like your mindset, your mood doesn't match what you're doing. But the thing about discipline, the reason why it's so important to be a disciplined artist and to paint when you don't feel like it, or to write when you don't feel like it, or if you're a carpenter, to keep working even though you're sore and you don't feel like showing up for work. The reason to persevere is because when you get on the other side of that challenge or that roadblock, you're stronger and you're more capable of moving forward as an artist. So I don't know if this answers your question adequately, Ashley, but I think, yeah, I've been doing this long enough that so many paintings meet the description you were asking about, which is, I hate, oftentimes I hate a painting in the middle of the painting. I'm going to take a risk here and show you a painting I'm working on that I really don't understand. maybe you'll understand it. It's kind of strange. And it's sort of it's midway through whatever it's going through. I don't know. I sort of see a figure in there bent over maybe, but I don't know where it's going, and I'm actually don't like it at the moment, but maybe there are things about it I do like, and I like some of the textures. I like some of the colors, some of the stuff that's going on in the background, if it does have a background. But, right now it's just it's just foreign territory because it's a new painting and it's something I have to work through. But I'm not going to quit. I'm going to see it through eventually, even if I have to obliterate it. Actually, one last thing I'll show you. I had a painting like that was not working at all. And I did completely painted over top of it. There it is right there. And you can still see, it's actually my daughter's favorite painting that I'm working on. You can see if I get up really close, some of the stuff sort of underneath that rich, slightly acidic yellow. But it's hard on a computer screen to make out what's going on there. Here's another painting I'll share with you. This is another painting of my grandson that's maybe a little strange, not finished, and I don't know if I'm gonna finish it. I may just leave it the way it is. I kind of like it the way it is, even though it's not expressing happy, warm feelings. He's an interesting kid. He's older now. That painting was from when he was about 10 or 11 years old. He's now 18. He's going to be going to college soon, and he's a poet. Interestingly, one time I said, his name is Will. I said, Will, I think you must have gotten my genes. I'm so sorry. Because to be an artist it's great, but it's also a challenge. You don't get nice, neat answers about everything. You get a lot of uncertainties. Yeah. Christy, how are we doing for time? Are we?
Sorry, I was mesmerized by the work. We have, yeah, like another 5 minutes if there are a couple of other questions. This
You
is
wanna-
fascinating,
yeah.
seeing the work. Other questions, things you're thinking about, folks?
I just had like oh, sorry, did I cut someone off?
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Nolan.
I saw like in that first painting that you had showed us, it looked like there was like kind of a body, and then it looked like there was mountains over it. It kind of to me looked like the circle of life in a way, like how death kind of makes up life, I guess.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, I'll have to think about that. Yeah, I think you're right. There is kind of a mountainous kind of, I saw it as almost like two figures wrestling. I started thinking it might be about, Jacob and the angel, Jacob wrestling with God, and then he's given the name Israel. But I'm not sure about that. I'll just have to keep painting and find out. But yeah, I like that, the circle of life. That's good. Oh, by the way, I'll have to keep painting and find out. I'll share a story with you might find interesting. J.R. Tolkien, who wrote Lord of the Rings, was asked once, what was it like to write this incredible, magnificent trilogy of books that have been translated into more than 40 languages? And he said, well, I'd started the Fellowship of the Ring, and I'd gotten the hobbits as far as the town of Bree in the story, but I couldn't figure out why Gandalf hadn't shown up. I had to write the book to find out. I think a lot of artists have this experience. Tolkien said I had to write the story to find out what was going to happen. The other thing he said was I couldn't figure out why Gandalf hadn't shown up at Bree like he'd promised, and I didn't know who that shadowy figure over there sitting in the tavern, Strider. I could not figure out who this guy is, if he's dangerous or if he's good. Of course, Strider ends up becoming Aragorn, the king, this great virtuous person. So, yeah. Rachel, you had a question.
Yes, I was curious to know if anytime during your art experience, if you had moments of like doubting your own abilities or your own capability to produce art, and like if just like how you dealt with that or how you dealt with your own insecurities, if any arose.
Yeah, the truth is, Rachel, those doubts have been with me my whole life and are currently with me. In fact, here I am in my late 60s, having painted for a half a century, and I'm still full of doubt and uncertainty about my work and about my calling. Well, I take it back. I've never had serious doubts about my calling as an artist. I've always felt pretty sure of that. But as to whether I can actually do it, that's another matter. Yeah, and how do I work through it? I think I sort of answered that earlier when I said you have to paint your way through. I suppose if I were a filmmaker and I hit a wall with a film and felt like it was going nowhere, and I know that when you're in filmmaking or in theater or that kind of stuff, you have a lot of other people depending on you. As a painter, I don't have a lot of people depending on me. I'm sort of here alone in my studio most of the time. But I know this is true for every artist I've ever talked to. You just have to work through it. You have to get up and keep trying. C.S. Lewis once said, sometimes the only power that God gives us is not the power to be virtuous, but to keep trying to be virtuous. And I think there's a corollary there with our art making, that sometimes all that we can do is just try. And it's quitting that's the problem. It's to stop trying and to cave into despair, which is not an option for Christians. We are not given that as an option. But the good thing is we have each other. We're not really alone. So, when we do feel like we're in despair, we just have to turn to our friend and have them keep us from falling into the pit, So.
We have time for maybe one final question.
Do you think your art making process changed after you became a Christian? And if so, how?
I don't think it changed fundamentally. I think what happened was that the well springs of motivation began to change. Um, but it's interesting, the earliest motivations that I remember in my childhood were all about God. They were all about trying. I mean, I loved God when I was a little kid. The bit that was revealed to me about God in Sunday school, because I did grow up in a nominally Christian family, although we never talked about, we never read the Bible together. We never talked about God in our family, but we did go to church. And I heard the gospel, and I loved God from the time I was little, and I wanted to make art for God. And then that got lost somehow. In my late teens and early 20s, it was all about me. And I think that's also what went wrong in my marriage in those early days of our marriage, is that it was all about me. And that's no way to have a relationship. It can't be about you. In fact, if there's any message from the Bible that can be summarized, this is not about you. And so I think what changed for me was I regained some of that childlike motivation that I had as a kid through paying attention to Jesus. You know, he says you can't even see the kingdom of God unless you're like a child. And I think what he means by that, when he says, you know, it often gets translated different ways, but what he was saying there was the kingdom of God is invisible to people who are obsessed with themselves and obsessed with gaining an advantage or, you know, getting status. You know, a good, healthy child isn't interested in status. They don't even understand what status is. They're too busy learning. At some point, children do become self-conscious, and it's kind of sad when you see that happening, because then a lot of the joy goes out of their making of stuff, you know, because every kid is an artist until they learn not to be. But yeah, I think that's, Sophia, I think that's what happened, was the Holy Spirit invaded my heart and cleaned things up a bit. It wasn't easy. But hey, Christy, how about if I close us with a word of prayer?
That would be great. Let's do that.
Okay, let's pray. God, we are in this strange room together, this virtual room, but you are here. There's nowhere that you are not. And so we acknowledge you now. We know that you've been here all along. And I pray for each one here, including myself, that we would forget everything that I said today that isn't from you, and that everything that is from you would penetrate deeply and empower us to be better students of you, better followers and people who study your ways, and free us from the fears and the selfishness that tags onto us. Thank you for everyone here. I pray that you keep everyone safe from all the dangers known and unknown, seen and unseen of this night, and that everyone would have a perfect rest and a good meal and some good times together. And we pray this in Christ's name. Amen.
Thank you, Professor Herman. This is, wow. This was both challenging and truly encouraging. Thank you for your time. And thank you, all the students. Thanks for joining us for our first Fine Arts Salon. Be checking out announcements. We've got our next one coming up. Let's see, Dr. Norm Jones, some theater talk, Velveteen Rabbit recap in October. And then Dr. Chris Underation, our newest Comm Arts faculty member, will be presenting some of his research in November. So be looking for those announcements. And that is it, everyone. Thank you. Thanks again, Professor Herman. This is great. Nice to see everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.